Imagine for a second what it would feel like to receive the one thing from your father that everyone else dismissed as worthless. While your sister inherits millions, you get a dusty old box of vital records. A joke, right? A slap in the face. What would you do in that situation? Would you be consumed by bitterness? Or would you find a way to turn that seemingly insignificant gift into the most powerful weapon you could ever imagine? This story isn't just about money. It's about what truly defines a legacy. It's about the silent echoes of a man's life and a daughter who had the patience to listen. This is a tale of betrayal, of a quiet and devastating form of revenge, and of a treasure hidden in plain sight. It's a story about a daughter who was always the other, the one who was never quite enough, and how she used her father's forgotten passion to expose a fraud that no one else could see. Stay with me until the very end, because this narrative will make you question everything you thought you knew about family, inheritance, and what it truly means to be seen. My father, Robert, wasn't a man of grand gestures. He was a quiet, meticulous soul who found solace in the simple things, especially his music. Our house was his sanctuary, and his sanctuary was a small, oak-paneled room filled with thousands of vinyl records. To me, it wasn't just a collection, it was the soundtrack of my life. Every Sunday morning, he'd put on some classical piece, and we'd sit in silence, reading or just being. He was a man of few words, but in the crackle of a needle hitting a groove, I felt his love more than any verbal declaration could convey. My stepsister, Clara, however, saw none of this. To her, those records were just old junk taking up space. She was the one with the grand personality, the one who filled the room with her laughter and her loud, charismatic stories. She came into my life when I was 10, a whirlwind of confident energy that immediately captivated my father. Clara was a few years older, and her mother had recently passed away, so my father, with his infinite capacity for empathy, took them both in. It was an instant shift. The quiet, introspective world I shared with my dad suddenly had an audience, an intruder. Clara was smart, ambitious, and she knew how to play the game of affection. She would compliment his taste in ties, laugh at his corny jokes, and always make him feel like the most important man in the world. I, on the other hand, was just there, the quiet girl who watched from the sidelines. As the years passed, my relationship with my father became more of a silent shared understanding than an overt bond. Clara was the one he'd take to business dinners. She was the one he would brag about to his friends. She studied business, just like him, and seemed destined to take over his successful company. I pursued a quieter path, something with art and history, a world my father never quite understood. It created a rift, not one born of anger, but of distance. He loved me, I knew that, but he was undeniably proud of Clara in a way he wasn't of me. I convinced myself that was enough, that a father's love didn't need to be equal to be true. When my father's health began to fail, everything changed. Clara took over. She managed his appointments, his finances, and eventually his entire life. I was pushed further into the background, the helpful daughter who brought tea and read to him, but had no say in the important decisions. Clara insisted on handling everything herself, claiming it was too much for me to deal with, and my father, weakened and exhausted, simply agreed. I didn't protest. I had my own life, and to be honest, I trusted my father's judgment. I believed he knew what he was doing. I believed he had everything under control. The end came suddenly, and with it, the reading of the will. I sat in a lawyer's office, feeling a knot of dread in my stomach, knowing what was coming. The lawyer's voice was dry and formal as he laid it all out. My father's entire estate, his company, his investments, all of it, millions and millions of dollars, was left to Clara. Then the lawyer paused, turning to me, and to his daughter, he leaves the entirety of his vinyl record collection and all its associated equipment. The words hit me like a physical blow. The room went silent. Clara let out a soft, almost triumphant sigh. It wasn't just a disappointment. It was an active dismissal. He had given me a collection of old records, while she received a king's ransom. The funeral was a blur. After the service, I went back to the house, to my old room, and just sat there. I stared at the closed door of the music room, a place I had not entered in months. The pain was immense. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the message. My father had left me nothing but a box of memories, while he had entrusted his life's work to the person who wasn't even his own flesh and blood. It was a clear statement of who he valued more. Clara, with her perfect smile, had won, and I was left with a box full of old junk. Or so I thought. The days that followed were a silent testament to my grief. Clara was busy with the lawyers, meeting with the board of directors, and moving her things into my father's study, turning his space into her office. I found myself wandering the empty house, a ghost in my own childhood home. The only place that felt remotely like mine was the music room. So one day, unable to bear the silence anymore, I unlocked the door. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, a smell that immediately brought a lump to my throat. I ran my hand over the spines of the records, a familiar touch, each one a memory waiting to be played. I decided to start going through the collection, not to find anything of value, but to simply connect with him again. It was a way to mourn, to listen to the man I knew through his choice of music. As I carefully pulled out an old jazz record, I noticed something odd. Tucked behind the album sleeve, there was a small, folded piece of paper. It wasn't a note, but a simple list, handwritten in my father's neat, precise script. It was a list of names and dates, almost like an old ledger. It didn't make any sense, so I just tucked it away in my pocket and moved on. Over the next few weeks, I became a student of his collection. I would pull out a record, listen to it, and then check the sleeve and the inner folds for anything else. Soon, I started to find more of these lists. They weren't random. They were meticulously placed. One was tucked inside a rare classical album. Another was taped to the back of a vintage rock and roll record. Each list was different, but they all followed a similar pattern. Names, dates, and what looked like a series of codes or numbers. The more I found, the more a strange curiosity replaced my grief. This wasn't just a collection of music. It felt like a puzzle, a breadcrumb trail my father had left for me. The breakthrough came when I found a list tucked inside his favorite Miles Davis album, Kind of Blue. This one was different. At the bottom, in small, almost illegible handwriting, it said, "For my quiet one, the one who truly listens." A wave of emotion washed over me. It was a message, a secret I was meant to discover. He knew I was the only one who would appreciate the records, the only one who would take the time to look for more than just music. He was speaking to me from beyond the grave, not with words, but with a silent, cryptic language only we could understand. This wasn't a joke. It was a deliberate act. I began to organize the lists, trying to find a pattern, a key. I cross-referenced the names and dates, but nothing made sense. It felt like I was looking at a financial ledger written in a forgotten language. I thought about sharing it with Clara, but a feeling in my gut, a deep-seated suspicion, told me to keep it to myself. I had to solve this alone. I started to notice that many of the dates on the lists coincided with major decisions my father had made in his business. They seemed to correspond with certain partnerships, acquisitions, and mergers. There was a connection, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Driven by a new sense of purpose, I started to dig deeper. I went to the local library and got old business journals from the years listed on the papers. I cross-referenced the names on the lists with the people mentioned in the articles. Slowly, a horrifying picture began to emerge. The numbers weren't just random codes. They were financial transactions. The names weren't just contacts. They were shell corporations, offshore accounts, and partners who had been quietly bought out for a fraction of what their shares were worth. The lists were a record of illegal business dealings, a shadow ledger of my father's most questionable acts, all laid out for me to find. The realization hit me like a freight train. My quiet, gentle father wasn't just a simple man who loved music. He was a shrewd businessman who had engaged in some highly dubious, possibly illegal activities to build his empire. And he had documented it all, right there in his record collection, for me to find. The question, then, wasn't why he had left it for me, but why he had left it at all. Why create a roadmap to his own undoing? It felt like he was confessing, but to who? Was this his final act of penance, a way to clear his conscience? The more I looked, the more it became clear those lists were a secret history of his most significant business moves, meticulously hidden in a place no one, especially not Clara, would ever think to look. The thought of what I held in my hands, what was hidden in plain sight, was overwhelming. My father had left me the most dangerous kind of inheritance, the truth. As I pieced together the fragments, I saw a timeline of how he had built his empire, one questionable deal at a time. The more I dug, the more I saw a pattern of acquisitions where smaller companies were absorbed, their owners bought out for pennies on the dollar, just before their patents or assets were revealed to be worth a fortune. It was brilliant, ruthless, and completely under the radar. The kind of thing only a man who had left behind a paper trail for the one person he trusted to find would do. I also began to notice something else, something that made my blood run cold. There were certain transactions, certain dates that weren't on his lists. They were financial moves that had happened in the last 2 years of his life, when Clara had taken over his finances. I went to the courthouse and, using the dates I had, requested copies of some public financial records related to my father's company. What I found was a series of significant withdrawals and transfers, money that wasn't accounted for in the company's official statements. It was as if someone was slowly siphoning funds from the main account into smaller, untraceable ones. If this story has touched you in any way, if it's made you think about the hidden truths that lie beneath the surface, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. This story is a reminder that the most valuable gifts often come in the most unexpected packages. It's a message that we should never dismiss what others see as worthless, because it might just be the key to everything. Now, let's continue to uncover the truth. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together in a way that was far more sinister than I had ever imagined. My father's lists were a timeline of his life's work, a detailed account of everything he had done. But the missing pieces, the ones from the last 2 years, pointed to a new player, someone who had access to his accounts, someone who was slowly draining them. It couldn't be a coincidence. Clara was the one who had taken control of everything when he became ill. She was the only one with full access to his finances. Suddenly, The will made perfect sense. My father knew. He knew what Clara was doing. He knew she was a thief. The will wasn't an act of favoritism. It was an act of deliberate justice. He couldn't accuse her while he was still alive, not with his health failing, but he could leave me the one thing that would expose her. He had given me the tool, the key to unraveling her deception while making it look like I had been dismissed. He had given me a hidden inheritance, a treasure more valuable than any money. He had given me a way to fight back, quietly and devastatingly. Armed with my father's secret ledger and the public records I had found, I now had the means to expose Clara's fraud. But how? Going to the authorities with a bunch of old handwritten notes would be a joke. I needed something more, something undeniable. The records themselves held the key. They were the physical evidence, the proof that my father had created this secret system. The names, the dates, the codes, they were a language only I could speak, and it was a language of undeniable truth. The silence of the music room, once filled with the warmth of shared moments, now buzzed with the cold, hard energy of my mission. I was no longer grieving. I was calculating. I had to prove that my father's lists were not just random scribbles, but a meticulous ledger of his business dealings. My mind raced, piecing together a strategy. I realized that the best way to expose Clara was not to confront her directly, but to use the information I had to unravel her from the inside out. My father had left me the map, and I was going to use it to walk straight to the treasure. I started by looking for a specific pattern. I noticed that a few of the dates and names on my father's lists corresponded to the financial records of his company. I then used this to pinpoint a major acquisition he had made years ago. The list had a name, a date, and a specific number. I went to the courthouse and pulled the public records for that particular transaction. What I found was a shell corporation, a legal entity with no physical presence, listed as the buyer. The number on my father's list was the exact amount of the payout, a figure that was vastly different from what was reported to the SEC. This was it, the proof. The lists weren't just notes, they were a mirror, reflecting a hidden reality. My father had been running a shadow business alongside his legitimate one, moving money in and out of these ghost corporations. And in his last 2 years, when Clara was in control, a new series of similar transactions had begun. It was clear that she had found his system, but she hadn't found the master key, the record collection itself. She was using his method of fraud to enrich herself, but she was a sloppy copycat. The sheer audacity of it all was sickening. Clara had not just betrayed my father's trust, she had stolen from him while he was dying. She was using his own method to loot the very fortune he had worked his entire life to build. I remembered how she had insisted on being his sole caretaker, how she had isolated him from everyone, including me. It all made sense now. She wasn't doing it out of love. She was doing it to gain access, to control his assets, to steal. The inheritance she had received in the will was just a formality. The real money had already been transferred. I had to be careful. If I went to the authorities now, she would deny everything. She would claim my lists were just the random ramblings of an old man, that I was a bitter sister trying to discredit her. I needed to build an airtight case. I spent weeks coming through every single record, every single list. I created a comprehensive timeline, a detailed ledger that laid out every fraudulent transaction my father had ever made and every one that Clara had made in his last 2 years. The stack of evidence grew, and with it, my resolve. My father hadn't given me a toy. He had given me a loaded gun. The records were the bullets, and his quiet love was the trigger. He had entrusted me with his most dangerous secret, not because he wanted me to expose him, but because he wanted me to expose her. His final act wasn't to show favoritism, but to ensure that the quiet, overlooked daughter would be the one to get justice for him. My inheritance wasn't just a collection of music. It was the most powerful weapon in the world, and it was time to use it. My plan was simple, but required precision. I didn't want a public spectacle. I wanted to destroy her quietly, just as she had tried to destroy me. I scheduled a meeting with my father's lawyer, the same man who had read the will. I brought with me a suitcase, not of clothes, but of papers. The lists, the financial records, the copies of public documents. Everything. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Thompson, looked at me with a mix of pity and impatience. He probably thought I was there to contest the will, to make a desperate plea for a share of the fortune. He had no idea what was coming. I started by explaining everything calmly. I told him about the record collection, about the lists hidden inside the album sleeves, and about the secret system my father had created. He listened, his face a mask of polite skepticism. But as I pulled out the first list and placed it next to the corresponding court document showing the Shell Corporation and the financial transaction, his expression began to change. I laid out the second and then the third. His professional demeanor slowly cracked, replaced by a look of utter disbelief. He had spent years handling my father's legal affairs, and he had never seen a single one of these transactions. Then came the final blow. I showed him the timeline I had created, laying out the transactions that had taken place in the last 2 years. I presented the evidence I had collected, the proof that Clara had been siphoning money from my father's accounts. I explained how she had used his own hidden system, a system she had discovered but didn't fully understand, and how her clumsiness had left a new, much clearer paper trail. I explained how my father, in his final lucid moments, must have realized what was happening, and how he had used the will as a final desperate message to me, the quiet one, the one who listened. Mr. Thompson sat in silence for a long time, staring at the pile of documents on his desk. He finally leaned back, running a hand through his gray hair. This is unbelievable," he whispered. "You have no idea how deep this goes. These transactions, they could unravel his entire business, but more importantly, they are irrefutable proof of your stepsister's fraudulent activities. This is not just a family matter. This is a criminal case waiting to happen." A slow, satisfied smile spread across my face. I had him. I had the lawyer, the one person who could turn my evidence into a legal reality. I told him I didn't want money. I didn't want a single cent of the fortune Clara had stolen. All I wanted was justice. I wanted to see her face when everything she had built came crashing down. I wanted her to know that the quiet, overlooked daughter had been the one to do it. The lawyer, a man who had seen everything in his career, looked at me with a new sense of respect. He saw not a grieving daughter, but a force of nature. He promised me he would handle everything, discreetly and efficiently. He would use my father's lists to expose Clara's fraud, and he would do it in a way that would leave her with absolutely nothing. The next few weeks were a tense silence. The lawyer worked in the background, building the case, preparing the legal documents. I went on with my life, not speaking a word to Clara, who was blissfully unaware that her world was about to end. She was already living a life of luxury, spending the money she had stolen. She would call me sometimes, her voice full of saccharine pity, asking how I was, if I was handling the loss well. I would just smile, a cold, quiet smile, and tell her I was doing just fine. And I was. The final showdown happened not in a courtroom, but in the lawyer's office, the same room where the will had been read. Clara was there, along with her own legal team. She was confident, bordering on arrogant, her perfectly manicured hands resting on the arm of her chair. She thought this was just a meeting to finalize some paperwork, to put an end to the few legal loose ends that remained. She didn't even acknowledge me at first, just gave me a quick, dismissive glance. Mr. Thompson began the meeting not with a pleasantry, but with a statement. He informed her that my father's estate was being frozen due to newly discovered evidence of financial fraud. The look on Clara's face was a mixture of confusion and annoyance. "Fraud? What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice sharp with disbelief. The lawyer then laid out the first piece of evidence, a timeline showing the discrepancies in my father's accounts during his final years. Clara's lawyers scoffed, claiming it was just a clerical error, a simple mistake. Then Mr. Thompson turned to me and, with a subtle nod, asked me to present my case. I took a deep breath, and in a calm, steady voice, I began to explain. I told them about the record collection, about the lists hidden inside the sleeves, and about my father's meticulous documentation of his business dealings. I laid out the papers I had brought with me, the ones I had spent weeks of my life compiling. I showed them the specific transactions that my father had documented, and then the transactions that Clara had executed after she took over. Her expression went from confusion to utter panic. She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear and a dawning understanding. She knew. She knew what I had. She had found his system, but she had never known about his true secret ledger. She had been operating in the dark, a clumsy amateur trying to copy a master. Her lawyers, who moments before had been full of bravado, were now silent, their faces pale. The evidence was irrefutable. My father's handwriting, the dates, the specific amounts, it all matched. My quiet revenge was unfolding exactly as I had planned. Clara's lawyer finally spoke, his voice weak. This can't be right. These are just old papers." But he knew it was over. He knew that the evidence I had collected was enough to launch a full-scale criminal investigation that would not only prove her fraud, but also expose my father's long-term illegal dealings. It was a scandal that would bring down his entire empire. But I didn't care about the empire. I just cared about the justice. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. Clara looked at me, a silent plea in her eyes. "How did you find this? How?" I just smiled, a small, knowing smile. I said, "My father left it for me. He knew I was the only one who would listen. He knew I was the only one who would see the true value in his old records." In that moment, she didn't just lose a fortune. She lost her dignity, her freedom, and the belief that she had gotten away with it. Her carefully constructed world, built on a foundation of lies and greed, had crumbled, all because of a box of old vinyl that she had dismissed as worthless junk. This story about Clara and the inheritance wasn't truly about money. It was about the real nature of what we leave behind. My father, with all his wealth, didn't entrust his legacy to gold, but to a collection of sounds, to something that seemed worthless in the eyes of the world. He knew that Clara's greed would make her ignore what was priceless, and he knew that I, the quiet daughter who listened, would be the only one to unravel his final and most important message. He didn't give me a fortune. He gave me a truth. And that truth, hidden within the songs, was the most solid proof I could ever have. Perhaps the greatest lesson of this story is that the things of greatest value in our lives are rarely those we can count or weigh. They are hidden in moments, in gestures, in a shared silence between a father and a daughter. They are in the attention we give to what the world ignores, in the ability to see beyond the surface. The revenge for me wasn't about her downfall, but about the rise of my own truth. It was about proving to myself and to my father's spirit that I was worthy of his trust, of his last and most precious gift. The unconscious always invites you to look inward, and I invite you to continue this journey with me. If you were moved by what you saw, if something here resonated with you, consider subscribing to become part of our community of truth seekers. It's the first step to not missing the next revelation. leave a comment telling me what is the most unexpected treasure you've ever found in your life. Together, let's continue to decipher the secrets the world hides in plain sight.